I don't think by the time he got into his last year, I doubt if that featured very much.
You heard about old HK?
No, what?
Oh, he did frightfully well. Picked up the VC in Germany. At least I think that's what his mother said.
And very soon, as you know, he was supplying material to the West End stage, and sketches were appearing which Peter Cook had written.
I've got a viper in this box, you know.
It slightly irritated me seeing Kenneth Williams doing Peter's sketches, actually.
Oh, yes, it's not an asp.
Because I felt that Peter would have done him better himself.
Looks rather like one, but it's not one. Oh, no, I wouldn't have an asp.
His appetite had been whetted, obviously, by having contributed to one review with Kenneth Williams and then written an entire review.
Yes, indeed.
When you think that Friends in America now is written by what, 28 writers? Cheers was written by 36 writers.
That's bloody nothing compared to the ants moving all over your body.
For Peter to write an entire review is unbelievable. 26 sketches and still be at Cambridge and still get a good degree. Unbelievable.
I am a superior being.
He wanted a 3-minute sketch. Well, Chapman and I would take a day to write that. Peter just sat down, and 3 minutes later you'd have 3 minutes of funny material. I mean, it was extraordinary.
He was talent spotted for the writing of Pieces of Eight, and he was talent spotted again for as a member of the cast of Beyond the Fringe.
Four boys were all in black shoes, white shirts.
It was aggressive. It looked aggressively 60s.
They matched the mood of the time.
They were wearing dark clothes. There was hardly any set.
I suppose it was a sort of prelude to the sort of uniform that only 3 or 4 years later the Beatles adopted.
Young people suddenly said, this is what we're laughing at now. It was like a sudden turn on the gloomy, grim 50s. And just a way of getting a lot of that bitterness out.
Now, I was working as a doctor, as a young, newly qualified house surgeon.
I think at about this juncture, it'd be wise to point out to those of you who haven't noticed, and God knows it's apparent enough, that Jonathan Miller and myself come from good families and have had the benefits of a public school education.
And we had this fantastic meal, absolutely staggering lunch, quite near to University College Hospital where Jonathan was working.
And it was a slightly uneasy and guarded episode. We didn't know each other.
Whereas the other two members of the cast have worked their way up from working class origins. And yet Jonathan and I are working together with them in the cast and treating them as equals.
He seemed classier than all of us. He seemed to come from that world of a diplomatic aristocracy.
And I'd like to say it's proving to be a most enjoyable, worthwhile and stimulating experience for both of us. Wouldn't you agree?
Certainly, I'm most impressed by the whole thing.
And with this rather elegant, absent-minded look as he would sometimes float off, rubbing his chin, looking elegantly into the distance, and then suddenly, almost like a ventriloquist dummy, out of this elegant person would come these crazy people like Yale Whisty.
Now wait a moment, we'll put Lyme Regis where Great Yarmouth was.
Right, Ipswich where Lyme Regis was.
And Great Yarmouth where Ipswich was.
Oh, that'll fool the boss, eh?
I'll fool him, bye-bye.
Bye-bye, ta-ra.
Here, how do we get on?
He had an agent who renownedly advised Peter to have nothing to do with the show. And I'm glad to say Peter took no notice of him, but he muscled in on the negotiations for the fee. They'd all been offered £100 each, and with a great deal of effort, Donald got Peter's fee up to £110, which of course immediately bred resentment in the others. But the funny point was that, of course, after Donald had taken his £11, being 10% of this 110, Peter ended up with 99.
From the rugby fields into the air,
From the squash courts into the clouds,
From the skiffs into the Spitfires.
this was war.
It was material which was strikingly different from the sort of conventional review material that had prevailed in the West End in the previous 20 years.
Beckenstein. Sorry to drag you away from the fun, old boy.
That's all right, sir.
War's not going very well, you know.
Oh, my God.
Ken Tynan sort of dignified the show by saying satire advances into the 60s. We had no idea it was satire. And I think even to this day, Jonathan is very vehement that it certainly isn't satire.
Perkins?
Sir.
I want you to lay down your life.
Yes, sir.
We need a futile gesture at this stage.
Having been praised for being satirical, I suppose we adopted it with some sort of enthusiasm and said, well, that's what we are. But of course we weren't at all. We were just mildly cynical.
Get up in a crate, Perkins.
Sir.
Hop over to Bremen.
Yes, sir.
Take a shufti.
Sir.
Don't come back.
Right, you are.
I think Peter, who was much more directed towards Shaftesbury Avenue at that time, didn't want to be offensive.
Goodbye, Perkins. God, I wish I was going too.
Goodbye, sir. Or is it au revoir?
No, Perkins.
Peter's reaction to satire, I think anything that sold was a good idea for Peter and Dudley, really.
Would you send in the next auditioner, please? Mr. Spigot, I believe it is.
This was his heyday. I mean, this is when everybody knew who he was, and he was who he was. Let me tell you.
Cook was always the funny Cook. They couldn't compete with Cook. They'd all start being very funny. I mean, exhaustingly funny. And one by one they'd drop off. Alan Bennett couldn't really be bothered to. And by the end, it was Cook was still being funny.
He would go off into a sort of monologue, which daunted, I think, the three of us.
They all envied Dudley, because Dudley had about 50 girls following him everywhere. And Peter was very, very jealous of Dudley, even at that point.
You're it. I'm not it, Mr. Spigot.
Peter was very ambitious at the time of Beyond the Fringe. Again, not to anyone else's detriment.
Mr. Spigot, you are auditioning, are you not, for the part of Tarzan? Right.
He'd been in London for a year while I was finishing university, and he'd stopped being an undergraduate and was much more a kind of man about town.
Mr. Spigot, you, a one-legged man, are applying for the part of Tarzan.
Right again.
A role that is traditionally associated with a two-legged man. And yet you, a unidexter, are applying for the role.
Right.
A role for which two legs would seem to be the minimum requirement.
It's the same old Peter. What I couldn't quite get used to was because the rest of us were not earning very much money at those early stages, and the fact that I suddenly had this incredibly rich friend who would take me to, who would suggest that we meet in expensive restaurants and then go halves. And I always found that a bit difficult.
Your right leg, I like. I like your right leg. It's a lovely leg for the role. A lovely leg for the role. I've got nothing against your right leg. The trouble is, neither of you.
Wherever he went, he carried huge bundles of newspapers.
He was like a newsroom.
He lived in a world of magazines and newspapers and English Fleet Street gossip.
And this is why he was able to go on stage when Macmillan came to see the show, and the Macmillan sketch, which normally ran 8 minutes, ran close to half an hour.
40 years of political life, I've tried to do my best.
I went first to Germany, to the Bundesrepublik, and there I spoke to the German Foreign Minister, Herr...
Here was the Prime Minister of England being mocked on the stage in his own voice, in virtually his own words.
And
I remember the night when Macmillan actually came to the show, and Peter quite suicidally improvised some wonderful moment when he said, a lot of people said to me, what do you do when you hear of 4 young men appearing on the stage, one of whom impersonates you? What do you do? Well, I say to them, what I do is I sit in the 6th row with a fatuous grin all over my face and pretend it's not happening. We were standing in the wings, absolutely horror-struck by his peculiar sort of suicidal bravery.